It's good to be back in Albany. I went to high school here, so yeah, it's good to be back. Albany was a bit of a bogan town when I was in high school, so I thought I'd just wear a bit of a bogan shirt as homage. How things have changed. The first session this morning that I've got is really just about, these fundamental ecological principles and how they can play out in a production system. It's not so specific to orchards. And then as we go on in the day, we're going to sort of hone in more and more on some of the things you guys have brought up when we do our walk outside. But this afternoon, I'm really going into specifics, and we'll look at things like soil tests and different pests and diseases and how to plant fruit trees and manage them and so on. But yeah, this morning it's pretty broad. When we look at ecosystems around the planet, some of our ecosystems were like really, really fertile before we got involved in them. And, they were obviously, the organisms in there's obviously these systems where they were generating fertility, and yet it wasn't a system where, it created waste. Like the rivers were still pristine, despite all the fertility and the strong growth. The rivers were clean, the animals were healthy, the trees and so on. So, there's a lot that we've got to learn from ecosystems. And what I just want to nail down is just how these systems, how these different things are working, these different sort of parts of the program are helping to, create that productivity. Let's get into it. Just wanted to pose that question just as at the beginning, what came first? Sorry for you guys, I'm going to have to just do some swapping of sides here and there. Healthy plants, active microbes, good soil, or happy animals, and that includes humans there. Anyone want to take a punt at what they think came first out of that lot? Microbes?
Well, the soil had to be there before the microbes, but whether it was good soil or not.
Yeah. So that's the thing, isn't it? It's pretty hard. It is a bit hard to sort of say which of those came first, in a way. And this is the thing, when we're dealing with systems, it's not a reductionist approach. We can't just hone in on one element. We have to look at the system as a whole. And, when people talk of evolution and survival of the fittest, what we're learning now is it wasn't really like, there might have been a type of plant that looked like it was a fit plant and it survived the generations. But when you look deeper at it, it might have actually been the microbiome on that plant that was also a big part of its survival strategy. And so, it's a systems approach that we're looking at. And, when we're talking about ecosystems, you've got to look at all of those things. Just often, people will say, you've got to have really good soil to grow good plants. But I just want to pose the other view, which is that really without plants, our soil would be nothing more than mineral particles. So if you look at a desert or you look at the beach sand, and there's no plants, the soil has no structure, it has no color, it just falls apart. It's really just the rock material. And that's just like a profile showing that over, millennia, the plants have been changing the nature of that soil. So in some ways, I definitely think they might not have come first, but plants are probably one of the biggest players in the game. And the reason being, one of the main reasons is, of course, they're bringing energy into the system. And if we're creating living systems, things that, can run and jump and grow and produce, they're going to need energy, whether it's microbes or plants or humans. We're growing products to get energy out of them. And I think often what happens is when you can bring energy into a system, a lot of the other stuff flows from that. Like the microbes can go out and they can do their things, they can get nutrients or they can fix nitrogen or whatever. So it's really important to have energy in the system. And it's only the vegetative organisms that can bring energy in. So we could walk out and we could bask in the sun and we'd just get sunburned. So, we're not able to capture energy and make it biologically available for a system, whereas plants are. And just going back to high school for a bit, it's that basic equation, carbon dioxide, water, and the sun, and they make this wonderful thing called carbohydrates, which when you look at the word, it kind of makes sense. And we all know that carbohydrates are high in energy. So that's what plants are producing from just carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. So that's the energy that's used for, it's like the majority of living is created, the energy is created by these vegetative organisms. But also, the other thing about carbohydrates is they're actually the initial building block of organic matter. So if we're wanting to grow plants or microbes or animals, these are all organic, organisms and made up of organic matter. We're all carbon-based organisms. And essentially, where a whole lot of carbohydrates that have then been sort of modified and changed into other molecules, and you make proteins and all that, but the building block of all those organic molecules in the first place was a carbohydrate. So plants are not only creating the energy for the system, but they're also starting the chain of building materials, bodies and all that sort of stuff. So I think it goes without saying that they're pretty important. That's a great doco if you've got the time to watch it, a BBC doco. There's 3-part series, but this, the title says it all, Life from Light. Yep.
Mark, are you happy to share this?
Yeah.
Can I take notes?
No, I'll share it, yeah. And there's, anything else that comes up. And thanks, just like, I don't want to just talk to you. By all means, stop and ask questions anytime, folks, because this is for you.
Actually, Mark, just one thing that perhaps I should have mentioned. So we've got Michael over here who is videoing this. So the whole idea is that you'll get an edited audio of this. So that'll come as well. So if you're actually, just let me know if you're not happy to be a part of that, and we won't capture it.
Generally, the camera won't be pointed at anyone. It's just to get the sound readers.
Yep, cool. Thanks, Michael. So just Murray was just saying, actually, it's funny, he said in his intro that 80% of plant material is actually from the air, and this is just reiterating that it's like when a plant's living, it's actually mostly water, but when you dry the tissue, even after it's dried and you've got rid of all that sort of moisture in the plant, the 97.5% of what's left is actually made up of elements that come from the air. And again, it's through this photosynthesis reaction that this happens. Your carbon comes in, and nitrogen is also from the air. Plants don't actually fix nitrogen. There's bacteria that do it, but they bring nitrogen in from the air and they share it with the plants. So, really, we only need a little bit of the other stuff to complement that and to help them do this process, and we're on our way. Some of these other minerals come from the soil. You need them for structure and stuff like that. So you've got your calcium, magnesium, phosphorus. And then there's these trace elements, which Murray mentioned as well. You don't need much of them because they're kind of like keys. You use them for certain reactions. So they're cofactors, and basically it's like you can open a lot of doors with one key. However, there is a limit. So as the plants get bigger, you need those keys all around the plant, but you can use the same element over and over again, which is why you only need small amounts of them. But if you don't have them there, those reactions don't happen. And so they are really, really important, and they're often overlooked. So carbohydrates are, a really important thing. So there's a bunch of living organisms that want to get hold of some, humans, microbes, all the rest of it. We all need our carbohydrates, or we all need our energy source and our organic matter. But, the way nature's evolved is basically, if there's organisms that can return a service to the plants for the energy they receive and help the plants grow better, then the plants are going to provide more energy, and that's going to be a more successful system. And so there are a whole lot of different organisms that live in association with plants and have a bit of a reciprocal exchange relationship. So you've got organisms, like I said, like bacteria that fix nitrogen from the air. It's like the atmosphere is like almost 90% nitrogen as well. So it's free. There's organisms that are really good at getting minerals from the soil, like they can get into all the particles and dissolve things and that sort of stuff. There's networks. They can deliver nutrition, so they can take nutrients from far and wide and bring them to the plants. Really good at cycling nutrients. So when your organic matter that when your plants die and it ends up on the soil surface, they can sort of break that down and then return the nutrients back to the plants. There's also a plethora of compounds that all these organisms can produce that will help the plants with all sorts of stuff, promote the growth and help them with their immunity and regulate things and all that sort of stuff. So there's lots of compounds that are being produced by organisms in the plant, in the soil, and that's helping just the general plant health and growth. That's part of it. And they also produce this humus, which we'll talk a bit about in a little while, but that's really important for, helping your soil hold on to things, and also helping your soil have structure, like to crumb and be able to let air and water in and stay in place and all that. But we're going to talk about all these things in a bit more detail in a sec. They can also modify the soil conditions. They can change the pH and all sorts of stuff to make it better for plant growth and protect plants physically or, in a number of ways, just create barriers or ward off things or whatever it might be. And they also can distribute products like pollen in an orchard situation is a big one. In China now, they actually have to hand pollinate the flowers of their fruit trees because the bees are gone. Right, there's too much. They've used too many chemicals that have actually pretty much decimated the population. So people physically have to get up in the tree on ladders and pollinate each flower to get their apples. So pretty important organism, bees in an orchard. Yeah.
I've got a question about the trace elements. Is there, you will know this, like what is actually missing from our soils down here as far as trace elements?
In the white sand?
Yeah.
Just about everything except iron. Yeah.
So to get those trace elements in,
Yep.
do you have any hacks?
Yeah, foliar sprays. So
All the sprays, yeah.
yeah, so I will talk about that, Jem.
Yeah.
It's really hard to get foliar trace minerals into plants through the soil because even if they are in the soil, because you might have some areas in Albany that do have good trace elements, but they're subject to a lot of plant unavailability because of the soil conditions. So there's things like pH, or there's other things like the oxidation state, which I won't get into too much now, that can make them unavailable. So like rust, your rusty nails, everyone puts rusty nails on their fruit trees. It doesn't actually work because they're oxidized. It's an unavailable form of iron. So there's these nuances, but if we've got constraints in our soil, that's where a foliar spray can be really handy because it just goes straight into the plant. Whereas you put something on the soil, it's got to work its way through the soil profile, get to the roots, and be in an available form. It's quite hard to get the trace elements into plants that way. Yeah.
So Mark, I might just chip in here. I've got our soil test from 2003 in the orchard, so really gutless white sand. So what we were lacking were, cobalt didn't really even register.
Yeah.
1.5 parts per million.
Yeah.
Boron, iron was low in the sand.
In the availables. Yeah.
Manganese, copper, zinc, molybdenum. So all of them.
Yeah.
But I guess a little question I sort of had for you was, if you've got 10 trees, you might not do a soil test and send it away and pay $120, you might. It's a bit difficult to do a sap test or a leaf tissue test and then compare the two.
Yeah.
So it's getting to Jen's question. Do we just apply some, if we don't have these results,
Yeah.
is it just some general health principles, and how would we know? That's sort of one of my questions.
Yeah.
We know we're generally lacking, there might be some variation.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's...
You kind of have to approach it from two ways. One is the immediate, which would be a foliar spray, and I can guarantee that almost all of you would benefit from foliar trace element spray. Like it's not a huge amount, it's just enough to keep things ticking away. And the other approach is to improve your soil, like not just the amount of trace elements, but how your soil functions, and we'll get into that in a bit. And that's more of a longer term sort of making things available and cycling and all that.
Seaweed sprays for trace elements.
Yeah, they have a wide spectrum of lots of different elements, but in terms of amounts, it's pretty low. So yeah, I wouldn't rely on them as your exclusive sort of means of, but they're certainly a good thing to include in the program. Yeah. Yeah. We will nail down a lot of the specifics as the day goes on, don't you worry. But keep asking the questions, it's good. So, some of you have heard me talk before, so this is repeating a few things, so, I won't go into them too deeply, but this is just an audit that was done of the biomass on the planet, and it was done about a decade ago, and of the 550 gigatons or billion tons there is of living material on the planet, 450 of it is plants, okay? And then when you break it down, the next biggest group's bacteria, and then there's fungi and protists and viruses and archaea. All of these are microorganisms. So we've got like a vast amount of plants, big amount of microorganisms, and all of this is needed to support this amount of animals, the 2 gigatons here. And when we break the animals down, the largest group's the insects, then the fish, and then we've got like snails and slugs and all these other things, and then finally we get down to humans and livestock over here. So to support our sort of living systems, we really need a lot of plant activity and microbial activity and even insect activity, you know what I mean, in an ecosystem. So when you're thinking about creating an orchard that's an ecosystem, you know, if you just have your fruit trees and that's it, and no other ground covers or plants in there, or no, you know, not much organisms in the situation, you're going to have to support that with nutrition and fertilizers and things like that, because you haven't got all that production going on. And a lot of that we're sort of borrowing from photosynthesis in the past. We're using fossil fuels to make fertilizers and to do things to the soil and all that sort of stuff. So if we can use the organisms to do it instead, and, you know, really feed them up and get them going, then that's what's going to create a more productive system. They're kind of like genetic software, you know. We're recruiting all this genetic software that does all these wonderful things, and we're putting it together in a program. That's sort of what an ecosystem is. So how do we do that? How do we get a really functional, thriving ecosystem going with lots of energy getting caught and materials getting turned over and all that? And it involves, like I say, this bringing in lots of different software. And so I've used this word functional diversity. So it's not just a diversity of organisms, but they're functional. They're all doing things like we just talked about. And it all starts with plants, because the plants are the ones bringing in the energy. But not only that, with the plants, different plant types will host different types of organisms. Just like animals will eat different types of plants, so there will be different animals that live off different types of plants. Like we would struggle to survive if we just had to eat grass. So we rely on certain types of plants. It's just the same for certain bacteria. They live off certain types of plants, certain types of fungi. Some are nitrogen fixing, some are mycorrhizal fungi. They only live on, you know, some species and not others. And so if we want to recruit all of these different organisms, then we need to have a diversity of plants in the picture, different functional plants. And, you know, then there's also things like some plants will have root systems that will go deep to get water and nutrients. Some will survive the summer better, and some will dry off in summer. And so all the time you've got this different functional diversity going on with different plants. And it means more and more different, above and below ground, different microbes and animals getting involved, and, you know, better access to all the stuff that's there, and services and all that sort of thing. So again, a whole community, and it starts with this plant diversity. Just to give you an example of, on a small basic scale, this is just what they call these multi-species cover crops, where in this instance, just a blank template planted a range of things together and then separated the species that are in that out into different beds. And you can see the peas here, which are planted at the same time, and how they're struggling compared to how they're growing in the diversity. So there was no fertilizer or anything involved here. This is just purely the fact that they're growing with other plants and they're sharing resources and services. Whereas in this monoculture situation, they need fertilizer. And it's funny, Christine Jones says like 99% of the research that we do, the funded research, is on monocultures, and we still haven't got it right. So we need to look at this diversity. You know, where in nature do you see a monoculture? It's just very rare, to the contrary. So I just want to talk a little bit about what goes on underneath the soil, because we don't see that much. So this area, the rhizosphere, is really like a biological hotspot. You know, there's as much life in the rhizosphere as there is anywhere on the planet. And the reason being is, of course, the plants are catching this energy, these carbohydrates, and they're sending them straight to the soil. And then what's happening is the microbes are coming in for their feed, and they're doing all the wonderful stuff we talked about. And, you know, in the process, there's these sugary, sticky substances, and the microbes are sloughing things off, and they're bringing things in together and binding soil particles together. And it creates this whole other universe around the plant roots. And if you did a soil test there, and away from that, it would be chalk and cheese. Like, it's a whole different setup. The amount of life in there and activity is just so different. And in that, they're doing all the things that are going to help the plant grow well. So they might modify the pH. They might, you know, cycle some nutrients. The plants actually put out specific exudates that will turn on certain microbes if they need certain things. If there's an attack on one plant, they might send a message through the network to the other plants around that there's actually something going on, and they need to recruit some sort of biochemical weaponry or something like that. So yeah, all sorts of stuff, but it's really a lot happening in there. And it's important, you know, that we keep our roots intact in the soil. These are just breaking it down a bit to some of the organisms. You've got your nitrogen fixers. This is a legume, and they actually host nitrogen fixing bacteria, but you've also got, all plants will have nitrogen fixing bacteria living around them, but they might not be living in the roots. They're just around and still fixing nitrogen. But the legumes actually make a house for them as well, and that's when we see these. And if you've ever pulled up a legume and pinched it, you'll see that pink colour inside the nodules, and that means that they're doing their thing. Mycorrhizal fungi networks. I mean, you know, you might have the roots just there, but you look at these fine hyphae, they're microscopic. They really get right out into the soil. They burrow around all the soil particles. They can get into all the nooks and crannies, and they can, you know, acquire nutrients, dissolve nutrients in the soil. And even around if you look up at microscope footage, you'll see that on the mycorrhizal fungi hyphae, there's like a highway, a water film, and there's microbes shooting up and down it and delivering things and dissolving things and so on. So it really, really improves the whole root system exponentially. And also mycorrhizal fungi is really good at releasing this stuff called glomalin, which binds soil particles together. It's like a long-term soil carbon. Really good stuff. Who here has heard of rhizophagy before? I know some of you who've come to my things might have. Yep. So plants are not vegetarian, they're microbivores. So like us, they want to eat foods, whole foods. They don't just want to eat nutrients. Sure, they can get their energy from the sun, but they want whole foods sometimes. And you know, it takes a lot of effort for a plant to take some nitrogen from the soil and then turn it into an amino acid and then turn it into a peptide and then a protein and build all these molecules, when really they could just eat a microbe that's already done all that work for them. And it's like eating, you know, your complete meal at dinner time. And it just saves them a lot of energy and, you know, just makes them much more efficient. What this guy, James White, who's done this work, it's quite recent, but, you know, it's growing. They're really finding out so much really quickly. In this instance, he's dyed the bacteria, and the bacteria is now, you know, you can see it's getting taken up into the plant. These, what they call endophytes, they live in the plant, and they're living in the roots, but they're also getting transferred up the stem and through the leaves and even up into like the seeds, so that the plant will deposit the bacteria it needs for the next generation in the seed, so that when that seed's planted, it's already got the population ready to go and the plant can start eating its microbes. It's also what happens is when they take these bacteria in, it happens in the root tip where the cells are a bit fluid, still a bit plastic, and they actually ingest these whole bacteria and then kind of capture them in the cell, and then they dissolve the membrane of the bacteria. They eat it. It's full of amino sugars and stuff, and they get all the contents out of the bacteria, all the metabolites, the fluids, and all these good substances. And then once they've sort of done that and they've had their feed, they spit the DNA of the bacteria back out into the soil. And in the process of spitting out the DNA, it initiates the formation of a root hair. And so this is what, when you see, if you've ever seen footage of root tips growing, I should have put one in here, you'll see just behind the root tip all this fuzzy root hair growing out, and that's this rhizophagy cycle happening. And then the bacteria reforms in the soil and sucker for punishment, they come back for more. So yeah, it's a really cool system of setting up, you know, good nutrition, and it's really important early in a plant's life when they've got lots of root tips and they're just kind of trying to get out into the soil and form root hairs and all that sort of stuff. That's all right. So these endophytes, they're only active on living plants. They need living plants. So your nitrogen-fixing bacteria, your rhizobium, they're only active on living plants. Your mycorrhizal fungi, only active on living plants. And then these other ones that are living in the plant, they're only active on living plants. So when the plants die, they have to go into dormancy. So they're not the type of organism you can culture in compost. So, you know, you get your compost, you make things. All the compost is not living plants, it's dead material, and that's different groups of organisms. So to actually grow these endophytes, you have to have living plants, at least some of the time growing in the system. But when the plants complete their life cycle, when they go to seed, like an annual plant, say like something grows in winter and it dies in summer, as the plant sets seed, the microbes also set seed. So they produce spores or cysts or eggs or whatever. So part of the process of producing these endophytes is letting plants go to seed, because they deposit it in the seed, they reproduce in the soil, and sometimes we just never let our plants get to that stage. You know, you look at the pastures and they're just kept like a lawn all the time, whereas in nature you've got plants growing wild and seeding everywhere, and it's pretty important. So you can get, they reproduce in the roots, in the seeds, the soil around the plant roots, you'll get all this material, these endophytes, and you can introduce them. So you can bring in inoculants to introduce these into your systems. Again, different plant species host different ones, so you need a range of plant species, and these are some of them. Like, so with our legumes again, some plants are really good mycorrhizal hosts, like sunflowers and millet and so on, a lot of the grasses. And then there's tree families that host specific types of mycorrhizal fungi as well. So in an orchard situation, there'd be it's a different type of fungi. It's ectomycorrhizal. This is endo. One burrows into cells, one just lives in the roots in between the cells. But that's just pedantics. Really, what I'm saying is a diversity of stuff again, and, having all of those things in your system can be helpful.
Sorry.
Yep.
Back to that. The, whether they're genus or families, what are they?
They're families.
Yes.
So, so that's
Myrtaceae.
pine family, Myrtaceae, eucalyptus family. I'm not too sure of these ones. I think one of them is like beech or, more of those deciduous type things. This is just an example of cultivating everything in a system. So this is like growing a cover crop or a diversity of species and actually letting them go to seed, and this is something that people don't always do when they grow a cover crop. Not only this year are we going to get like heaps of plants coming up because it's all set seed, but also all the microbes in the soil have propagated, and we've also got all this mulch on top that protects the soil over summer and stuff. So it's just something that, it's a strategy you can do. Yep.
I think Gemma's got a burning question.
Yeah, sorry, Gemma, you're sort of a bit dark there. You're blending into the bricks.
How does cover crops
Yep.
go for this
Yep.
season? Now is a good time to start.
Yeah, like
cover
we've...
crops. And what would that look like? What are they?
Yep. So, we've got a lot of leverage now because the rain's coming, so they're going to get watered. And also...
Keep coming.
What's that? Yeah, will the rain come? And because it hasn't been raining, unless you've got sort of kikuyu or in low-lying areas, you might find that you've got no weeds, like it's dry in the pastures. So you don't have to spray or dig your weeds or anything like that. It's easy to seed into it. So now is a really good time. And you're looking at, to really build, the soil builders are plants that have to produce an expensive seed in a short period of time. The reason being is that they then put lots into the soil early in life so that they can draw on it later. So the things that produce expensive seeds in a short period of time are like our cereals, so oats, rye, barley, etc. Our legumes, like a legume is an expensive seed. It's full of protein. That's like peas, vetch, ceradella, whatever, clovers. And then there's other things that are oil seeds like linseed or flaxseed, or your brassicas like radish and turnips and all that. They produce a canola. So
Kind of like a mix that you can just...
Yeah, so you're normally a mix of all those things, and then you've just got to seed them. And because the birds love all those seeds, you've got to seed them in the ground, not just throw them around, otherwise they dry out too. So you've got to get them in the ground, and before the rain if you can, or after the rain you just got to do a bit of weed control. Yeah. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the specifics as well. So animals, we've just talked about all the microscopic stuff, especially the stuff that lives on living plants, but animals play a big part in the system too. So one of the jobs that they do is they get rid of things that are not growing so well, make way for things that are produced better. So often you'll see that you'll plant certain plant in your veggie garden or whatever, and it just gets hammered by the pests, whereas a weed doesn't. And in that case, your soil's probably not ready for that species. It's not going to give the microbes the food they want. So they're like, let's get rid of it and we'll have the weeds instead, because at least they grow well and they can feed us. And so, they kind of, even though it might not be ideal for what you want, the animals are actually managing things to make the system more productive for you. And sometimes it just takes time to get to the point you can produce those vegetables or whatever it is, fruit that you want to produce. They're really good at regulating vegetative growth. So, when things, when grass grows and it gets a bit long in the tooth, sometimes having an animal come past and eat it, and then it initiates a new flush of growth. Or we might prune in the orchards, like centropic agriculture, we'll prune fruit trees just to create a flush of growth. So sometimes when trees are getting a bit old and, a good pruning can help them really start to grow new leaves, and then they photosynthesize faster again and all that. The animals do the same thing just by eating. They're really good at turning over organic materials. So you think of like you've got some straw or some grass that's grown and it's died, and if you tried to put that in a pot or plant something in a straw bale, it's not going to grow very well. But if you then put it through an animal, when it comes out as manure the other end, it's suddenly a product that's, all the minerals in that straw have been released, and so it suddenly becomes something plants can use again. So when we've got fields that are just long grass and you put animals in there, they quickly turn that into fertilizer, probably faster than anything else. They also take stuff into the soil, like worms and dung beetles will make holes, and in the process they'll create tunnels and stuff as well for water to get in and air and stuff like that. And because animals can move, they can deposit stuff, so they can take stuff from the valleys to the ridges and move things around through the landscape. And in an orchard situation, you can use them as well, or veggie garden situation sometimes to keep pests and weeds in check. We'll talk a little bit about that in a sec.
Would this apply to chickens as well? Because in my area, the chickens have left the land looking like a wasteland.
Yeah.
Not fertile.
Yeah. So I mean, it's certainly like the right animal for the right place, managed the right way. And this is something like there's a bit of a myth that chickens are an excellent animal for orchards. We're going to talk about animals later, but I wouldn't choose a chicken as my main animal in an orchard. Maybe every now and again you could put one in there just to clean up some rotten fruit, but leaving them in there full time, like they just digest too much and the plants can't grow. They just dig it all up and make holes and expose roots and all that. So I think chickens are not always the best animal in an orchard situation. They pollinate as well.
Visiting rights.
Visiting rights, that's it. And that's animals are generally migratory in nature. They wouldn't stay in that situation unless they had to, because they go out and get fresh food elsewhere. I think it's really important that you have dinosaurs in your garden. They really help with a lot of things. If you do have them, though, you've got to keep overgrown zucchinis on hand to save you when they catch you. So I specifically got ducks up because I think they are actually a good example of an animal you could use in an orchard really well. And I didn't really get them to eat the overgrown zucchinis. I got them to, in this case, like we know they love snails and slugs, but they love slaters as well. And slaters are they're a crustacean, so they're full of calcium and chitosan, all these good products you get in their shells, and ducks pretty much eat them and liquidize it out the other end, all that high fertility. I just sometimes when I'm gardening, if I use weed mat, which I'll talk to a bit later, when I pull it up, there's lots of slaters on it, or slugs, and I let the ducks in, and this is what they do. They're pretty happy, yeah.
Do they live in your orchard?
Yeah, I move the ducks between veggie gardens, orchards, anywhere really. They're not really in the veggie garden. They sometimes can be a little bit destructive, but not too bad. Not like a chicken. And certainly at certain times of year, you put them in and they just clean up the populations of snails and slugs. And because I've got a lot of organic matter in all my veggie gardens, I really need them. They're a pretty important animal. Guinea pigs, not always the most practical animal, but I just thought I'd put a video in here. They do eat things that they're a rodent. So like I kind of hope they displace the rats in the ecosystem and they eat all the things the rats would eat, like these pumpkin stalks and carrot tops and celery leaves and stuff like that, or bread, stale bread.
Do they ring bark trees?
They might well. So these are in like a cage. So I'm using them as a lawnmower in the orchard and rotationally grazing them like you would cows or something like that. Anyway, it's just cute, really. You don't have to have guinea pigs. This is where it gets gruesome. That's a cabbage white butterfly. That's the caterpillar, the one that eats your brassicas. And this is a bunch of larvae erupting out of it. Anyone want to take a stab at what sort of larvae it is? What creature? Wasps, yeah, I heard someone say it. Wasps have these amazing, they do some crazy stuff. If you want to listen to podcasts on wasps, it's quite disturbing. In this case, they sort of hack the caterpillar's brain, they make it eat lots, and they eat it out from the inside out, but leave the organs intact until they really are ready, and then they just wipe it out and erupt and come out of the caterpillar. And actually the video worked. I didn't think that was going to work. You can see them just coming out. Oh, all right, enough of that. This is the same caterpillar about 4 hours later. You can actually see the cabbage leaf there, the purple cabbage. And they've now pupated and they're going to come and become wasps and find some other caterpillars. And so they are helping, even though they're gruesome.
What sort of wasp is it?
I don't know, actually. Yeah, it's not your paper wasp. They're not the ones that you see around your house or anything like that. They're quite a small wasp. Yeah. Native bees, love them. Blue-banded bees, you see those around? So cool. I mean, making little bee hotels in your garden, it's a great thing. They pollinate, they're just so cool. Oh, it's doing its little thing. It goes.
Is that a blue banded?
Yeah,
Something singular.
yeah.
Are they happy to stay in the same environment where the European honeybees, or do they?
There is competition. There is competition to some degree, but yeah, there's a bit of crossover too. So yeah, I like to think with animals, and this comes down to the management, that like in nature, animals were part of a system. Sometimes we sort of like, I showed you that thing that that chart which is showing like the breakdown of all the biomass on the planet, and you saw how small a portion the animals were. And yeah, I think in some of our production systems, we have a lot of animals, but not enough plants and not enough microbes. And then we have to supplementary feed the animals all the time, and they eat it bare. They never let the plants get away. And I think in nature, these big herds that did support big mobs of animals and stuff, huge plethora of bird life and insect life. But there was always in the system they were moving around, and they weren't just overgrazing any one thing. They kind of co-evolved with the plants. And I think that in a way, if you can manage them properly, what's best for the animals is also what's best for the pasture and the soil. But you've got to be careful, and we'll just talk about chickens, and just use chickens as an example. So you want to avoid overgrazing, and overgrazing can be a number of things. It's not just eating the ground bare; it's also being selective. So if you put chickens in an orchard, they might eat certain plants out all the time, and they sort of will leave your woody, poisonous, thorny things, and then over time you're going to have more of those in your orchard and less of your nutritious, nice herbaceous plants. So that can be a form of overgrazing where they're in there and they're being selective. They can also not give plants time for recovery. So when you eat a plant, especially perennial plants, you want to give them time to recover, get their root reserves. And if they're constantly there, they're just going to keep going back to their favourite plants and eating them down until they no longer survive. Sometimes people will just leave the animals to just run in big areas, and what will tend to happen is they will sit under certain trees or scratch up certain trees more, or they'll sit in certain areas and they'll deposit the manure there. They won't spread it so evenly. So again, it's good to be able to move your animals if you can, and sometimes small areas at a time. In the orchard, not having them in there all the time, basically. And then obviously with the chickens, the soil disturbance is a big one. They're going to go for like the nice area around the fruit tree where it's all wet and you've composted, and they're going to scratch that all up first of all. So they really can be quite a pain. And then the large animals can cause compaction as well. So yeah, just how you manage them, I think, is really important. And again, we'll go into specifics on animals this afternoon for the orchards, that is. Decomposition, that's a big part of forest systems. So when you're doing fruit trees, there's always lots of branches, there's always lots of leaves falling on the ground. And if those weren't getting broken down, then they're just going to be sort of like, all your minerals are going to be tied up. So you need animals in there and microbes to break that down. And there's a whole plethora of stuff in the soil, so fungi, all your mushrooms and worms and bacteria and yeasts and so on that break it down. And they release the nutrients that are in that stuff so that the plants can take them up again. But also in this process of decomposition, they are releasing all these wonderful compounds. Like microbes are releasing wonderful compounds that help plant growth and immunity and all that sort of stuff as well. So that's why your compost is not just good because of the microbes in it, but also all these compounds, these biochemicals in the compost from all the populations that have been through your compost pile. So that's just an example, and talking specifically about composts, there's a lot of average composts out there. It's pretty hard to buy good commercial compost. A lot of them are like, they use a lot of material, like they have to deal with cleaning out yard waste or whatever, and they pile up these big piles and they get really hot, and then it gets too hot for a lot of the microbes. It burns them and it burns a lot of the humus, and then they run out of air because air can't get into the middle of the pile. So unless compost has been made properly, you'll probably find the quality of it is pretty bad, and most of the compost you get hold of is pretty bad. Decomposition is a natural process that happens when litter falls on the ground and it gets mixed with manure and all that. And it's a pretty aerated environment and it's not hot. Like you never stick your hand into the mulch under your orchard and go, oh, you know what I mean? So it's actually shouldn't be that hot a process. And so I love these compost systems like worm farms or something that's got air channels through it. This is a Johnson Sioux where we put pipes in and we took them out, and it just slowly decomposes, and it produces this really rich, putty-like compost. Worm farms, great again, because you're just adding a little bit at a time. You never make them too big. Most commercial worm farms are only about that high, or put down on the, in rows or whatever, but never too much material at once. So it never gets hot. Worms can't handle above 30 degrees pretty much. I love the red wrigglers. They reproduce all the time. You can see the eggs there, and they're really fast at breaking things down, and they produce this beautiful vermi compost. Just thought I'd show you the microscopic view, just because it's fun. This is a nematode. It's a good nematode. This is some protozoa. This is just from a compost sample. And they eat all these bacteria that are like, see them all moving around? And then just showing you some, this is some fungi. These are the hyphae of the fungi. See how it's got the segments in it? And again, all the bacteria. So that was like, you get compost, you put a tiny bit in a little vial, shake it up with some water, take a drop out of it, put a drop on a slide, flatten it, and then spend like half an hour looking all over the slide because there's so much going on. So just so much happening, in there. Yep.
You said that the compost being hot isn't good.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm kind of new to the garden thing here.
Yeah.
How do you get that if you're making compost in a big bin?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say it being hot is always bad if you want to sterilise it, and which like you have to do for commercial compost in Australia to sell it. Then heat is one thing you'd use to kill pathogens and weeds and stuff like that. But they have to do a hot compost. You have to turn it to let the air back in, because what happens when you first put a big pile of food down, it's like party food. The microbes come in and they're really active at the beginning, and then it heats up straight away, like within days, and they suck all the air out of the middle of it, and this air can't diffuse back into it. So that's why you've got to turn it to cool it down and to let air in, and then it'll start to get hot again. So for those that do controlled heat composting, like aerobic thermal they call it, you make your compost, you turn it, and you actually literally have to turn it like every second day for like 10 days to 2 weeks. And a lot of people do the opposite. They make their compost, gets hot, and they're like, oh, it's hot, it's good. And then it cools down. They're like, oh, it's cooled now, I've got to turn it again. But by then it's already too late. You've got to keep it aerated while it's hot and cool. Try and keep it cool. And then once it doesn't get that hot anymore, you can just leave it, and the fungi will grow through it and the worms will come in. So yeah, the other way is just to not put a large amount of material at one time in a pile, just a little bit at a time, keep adding a little bit at a time, and there's not enough party food for it to get really hot, and the worms will come in and they just slowly break it down. That's a bit more of a natural process. So yeah, I think heat's only really good if you want to sterilise it. But mate, I've tried making compost heaps where, like I made a heap where I turned it like for 2 weeks, almost daily, like every second day, every day, to try and kill the weed seeds, and it still had weed seeds in at the end of it. Like it still germinated weeds when I tried a germination test. So it's pretty hard to get all that material sterilised. It's a lot of work. In fact, I recruited my teenage son to help me with it a lot of the time. So a good start on life's really important. And when you think of plants, when their seeds drop from a tree or a bush, they generally drop through the residue and they end up in that kind of broken down composty layer. So compost is just a great addition to add to things when you're first planting them, whether it's fruit trees or cover crops or flowers or whatever it is. A little bit of compost with the seed or in the planting hole will just help them get this kind of activity going on, where they're colonising the roots and the plants are exudating and photosynthesizing and all that sort of stuff. All right, we're getting there. Humus, you guys got a sense of humus? Yeah. There's been a sort of contention about what humus is. People are like, oh, it's this really complex organic molecule. But now what we're finding out is that it's actually just organic materials that have been broken down into smaller and smaller and smaller fractions by microbes. And so it's primarily made up of actual microbes, the bodies of microbes, as they eat each other and digest and eat each other again and again, eventually to the point where they've eaten all the energy out of it, and it's so broken down that you can't break it down anymore. And at that point, it's these minute fractions, they have this charge, and so they start clinging on to the soil and they coat it. And also what happens is because they have a charge, they can hold on to things. So like your nutrients that you put into your soil or that comes out of the animal's rear end, it actually gets held on the particles, on these humus complexes. And also the soil particles will stick together because, you know, this charge, it starts to clump and make your soil a bit crumbly, I guess. And it holds on to positive ions and negative ions, whereas clay only holds on to positive ions. So if you've got a sandy soil, a bit of humus is going to go a long way. And yeah.
So is humus part of when you get humic acid?
Yeah.
Is humus. So if you put it in a liquid form into your soil, is that still like? Yeah.
So humic acid, this is where some of the confusion originally arose, is what they did is they get like old ancient organic deposits of humus and then they processed it like coal. So they'd get coal out of the ground and they process it with like potassium hydroxide to make humic acid. And in the process, they created these humic acid molecules, potassium humate, they call them. And they're very complex molecules, so they're actually quite different to the natural humus molecules that you get in nature. But they do have carbon and humus, so they are a sort of substitute.
They don't do this coating.
They do, but they're not quite the same. No, they don't have the charge that you'd have on really minute fractions.
Man-made product versus
Yeah. Yeah, and there's other, so there's a few things to it. And so some people are creating these products now that are not produced that way, but yeah, you can use them and then they might help in a certain situation. But if you can get some compost in your soil or grow cover, because like basically when you're growing cover crops, you're feeding microbes and then they all eat each other and they create humus and necromass. So the fastest way to create humus is really to grow it in your soil with plants. That's the carbon molecules that ultimately become humus. Other little tricks, you can add like biochar to your compost. That's got a lot of surface charge as well, and clay. So you combine that with the humus and creates all these nooks and crannies and surfaces and things like that.
So how do you feel about clay in the soil?
Yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah, I mean, if you guys got a sandy soil, if you happen to have a source of clay that you can add, because clay doesn't, because it's got not much surface area, not much charge, it really doesn't hold on to things very well. And so you'll find sandy soil, you can put a whole lot of compost in it, and you go back a year later and you just can't see anything at all. Yeah. So yeah, a bit of clay or biochar or whatever really helps with that. Yeah. Sand is a tough gig. It's low in nutrients generally, and Albany and Margaret River, where I'm living at the moment, are two of the worst places in terms of beach sandy type grey. Yeah.
Got a really good YouTube video that explains the cation exchange with the sand.
Yeah.
And the clay, how it's flat and sticks on if anyone.
Yeah, cool. Yep, share it with us, and then we can post it out.
To look at simply in a cartoon form.
Yeah, cool.
Not too crazy.
Yeah.
I wanted to share that video maybe either on the Facebook group or send the email through and I can send it out to everybody.
Yeah.
Cool. So what happens with these microaggregates is that they can be bound together, and you can actually make there's organisms in the soil that help make it into even bigger macro aggregates. So you get this fungi that will wrap around soil particles and bind them together. Plant roots and things like earthworms as well will get soil particles and they'll sort of combine them and put them out as these macro aggregates. And within a macro aggregate, it's really like a different environment to the bulk soil or just soil without, that's just loose. It's kind of contained. And there's a lot of the gels and the carbon substances and the sticky substances in there. So it's kind of like a gel. It holds onto water like jelly, It doesn't just dry out. So it stays moist and it creates the conditions that microbes can live in there. And these microbes are cycling nutrients and doing all that stuff. So it creates a really good environment in the soil for that sort of stuff. But also because they're big, it creates gaps. So air can still get into your soil and out of your soil. And there's organisms that like lots of air and there's organisms that like not so much air. So there's different habitats for all these different organisms. So yeah, aggregates are really, really important. And yeah, this is sort of how the process happens. Also decaying roots and all that create, channels for air and water. And once your soil's got that structure and that crumbliness, then it's stable. It doesn't get washed away or blown away so easily. That's just a real basic picture of an aggregate. And again, it's got these micro aggregates here, which is just a soil particle with, just small ones bound together. It's got fungal hyphae, which is really fine, wrapping in and around all of these and creating this macro aggregate, and a plant root as well, sticking to a plant root. And it just gives you an idea of, how they're made up. That was just a garden that I had where we'd spent a lot of time on the soil, and then we had to shut it down because the housing development, and the soak got filled in, so I didn't have any water. And for those of you that grow garlic, you can't save it for the next year. You have to plant it every year, otherwise it sprouts and goes rotten. So I had to plant it even though I knew I wasn't going to have water, and I just was hoping the soil would carry it through. So I planted it. This is harvesting it in around December, and I was really stoked because when I dug it up, there was still, you see that crumbly look there, and it was still moist, even though it was December. It was pretty, dry time of year, and you can see the fungal sort of strands and stuff like that there as well. So yeah, the work we had done on the soil basically got the crop through. Yeah.
So like, just I'm in the garden at the moment, and I'm getting ready for winter.
Yeah.
So when I'm kind of cutting out all the stuff from summer, is it good to just leave the root systems in there?
Yeah, so the studies now show that root systems build soil way faster than...
So not so much deep tilling, just...
No, root systems, they're creating all that structure and the channels for water to go in and out. And, like all the sheaths, that soil that clings onto them, Jim, like you think about it, it's a perfect system. Like there's a root that grows and it's got all that aggregated stuff, all sticky gels clinging to the root, and then the plant dies and it starts to rot and it creates more food, more stickiness, and then the water can come in and soak into all of those, like it's distributed and percolated into it and held.
I've found these old bits of carrot.
Yeah.
And I pulled them out and then I was like, maybe I should have just let them...
I mean, it's all food. It's all food and structure. And I mean, obviously there are plants that are going to resprout and you might not want them there, so you have to cut them out or pull them out or cut the crown out. But where you can, the studies have shown that roots build soil way faster than putting residue on top. So yeah, where you can leave roots in there. And an orchard, you shouldn't have to dig anything out, really. Yeah.
At a recent event that I know that you were at as well with the Ray Archuleta, he was talking about the aggregates, and he said that they don't receive water, they basically die within about 28 days. So how do you, if there isn't any water available, how do you make sure that those aggregates, I mean, what is it that, why did those aggregates survive, and why do aggregates survive in trees?
It wouldn't be a case of they don't receive water, just that it dries out. So I mean, the fact that they hold on to water means that they actually still have water for a long time. Yeah, just coming back to the basics and just finish off this presentation. So every living thing needs a source of energy, and it needs the materials for bodies and things like that. It doesn't matter what you are, you can, a whale, a bacteria, a tree, you need energy and materials basically. However, and these energy and materials are all around us. We've got sunlight and we've got minerals everywhere and nitrogen in the air, but they're not always biologically available. As humans, we need other organisms to make them available to us. And in a sense, when we're growing an orchard, what we're doing is we're making energy and materials available to us, biologically. We're literally eating sunlight, carbon dioxide, water, and soil minerals in an apple, basically. But the trees and the microbes have made them available. So they must be biologically available. And there are a huge range of mechanisms that different groups of organisms employ in an ecosystem. And there's some of them that acquire energy that are really good, the vegetative stuff. There's others that are really good at getting stuff from the soil. And then there's all those other services we talked about, like pollination, aggregation, and all that. So within a living community, it's the combined function of all these different organisms, the software, the genetic program that you build, and it's learning how to build that program to create a productive ecosystem. And, humans can be a very powerful tool in that. We can really create very strong productive ecosystems, but we can also destroy them pretty fast. Those two processes are a balance. So it's really important to keep in mind, you want energy coming into your system at all time, and you also want nutrients being cycled and managed, like your materials, okay? So if you have a system like a chicken pen, and the chickens are great digesters, right? They're really good at cycling organic matter, aren't they? So you can put straw in there and they turn it into manure, but that's all good. But if the chickens are eating all the plants out of the chick pen, then there's no energy coming into the system. So in a sense, it's an energy dead system, and you have to feed the chickens lots of wheat and bring more straw in to keep them going. In a more natural ecosystem, the chickens would be part of a system where there's lots of plant materials creating energy all the time, and then they're also cycling the nutrients, and it's a balance. And that's the things we've got to sort of think about when we're doing this is, how we manage these two processes, and they complement each other. It's on the flip side, you might have plants just growing, but if you've got no animals in your system to digest them, they kind of just turn into like straw, and then the straw just sits there and it's not cycled fast enough. So again, it's bringing all of these things in, and this is not a new concept. In biodynamics, they have spray 500 and 501. One of them is all to do with building humus and digestion and soil structure, and the other one is 501 is all to do with sunlight and photosynthesis. So that you use the two preps together to try and accentuate both those processes. And if you've got more of one, then you might use the other prep just to balance it up a bit. It's the same principle when you talk about resting and grazing in a rotational grazing system. You graze it to create that turnover, but you also need to rest it so the plants can grow and photosynthesize and recover. So yeah, it's quite universal. This is the last slide, folks. So hopefully you're still with me. I saved the heaviest brain one for the end. I just wanted to show you this because there's a bit of an order to how things happen. So when we think of plants creating this photosynthesis, these carbohydrates, they put out the carbohydrates through the roots as root exudates, but there's carbohydrates in living materials. So when we come and eat the fruit or the animals eat the grass, they get energy out of it. And then there's also still energy in the organic residue. Like if you took some straw and you took a match to it, it would burn. The sunlight energy is still there. And then you've got animals that, or microbes that will use these different sources of carbohydrates to perform services that help the plants. So that's the same thing we're talking about. But what I wanted to show is the cup's kind of bigger up here. If you think about it, when the plants produce root exudates, they haven't spent much energy. They just create the carbohydrates and they send them straight to the soil, and they're kind of like sugars. They're easy to digest. The microbes can use them straight away. You've got lots of energy. They can get nutrients and do all these things and give back to the plants. If you let the plants grow for a bit longer, while they're doing that, they're also growing. But in the process of growing, they're spending energy, right, just growing. And then they're creating sort of material, that cellulose and fiber and all that as well. So it's a bit harder for the animals to use that energy. They've got to digest it. So in the digestion process, we use energy as well. So we've actually used quite a lot of energy by the time we get to releasing some services back to the plant. On the very bottom of the scale, when the plants have died and the residues on the surface, a lot of the carbon and the nitrogen might go back to the atmosphere. And also by now, this very fibrous and lignified organic matter. And so then you have to have things like fungi and that are really good at digesting things to get the energy out of that, and then they return the services. Now, so what I'm saying is that when you want to produce a really dynamic system that creates a lot of nutrient availability and just really get things ticking along, this is where most of the action happens, in the root exudates. And I say this because most of us, when we start a garden or an orchard, we bring in dead materials to get the fertility going, whereas really we'd be much better off planting a whole lot of stuff. So we've got that happening, and then we get that happening as well, and then we get the residue from it at the end as well. So if we're growing an orchard, the last thing we want is a bare soil around our fruit trees. We want as much living green material going as possible. And you might manage that by bringing in animals occasionally to digest it. You might mow it. You might let it go to flower sometimes to produce, for the microbes to reproduce and the plants to reproduce seeds as well. But basically, yeah, this is where the action is mostly going to be happening. And so if you can get that happening, you don't have to bring in your straw and your compost and manure anymore, hopefully. I'm not going to go into that. That's just... okay, maybe briefly, it is the last one. So yeah, again, covering your soil with living plants and residue, always important. Diversity, which we've talked about. Try not to kill your biology. So, where you can, you want to avoid some of these things that are literally suicide. They kill biology. And, not always just the bad guys. Looking at how you manage your animals. It's not just mob grazing, but yeah, looking at not just leaving them in an area to do what they do. Trying to avoid compaction and disturbance in the soil, and Yeah, ultimately with conversion, like with tillage and stuff, like some of you who are starting on ground zero, you might have a hard soil or just a soil that needs a bit of breaking up. So that it has a place, but as your soil gets better and your ecosystem gets better, the less you need to do in terms of physical management because the microbes do it for you, and the less you need to do in terms of nutrition because the microbes do it for you. But initially, it might be well worth getting some of that stuff in there just to get things going. And so sometimes we have to bring in fertilizers and stuff like that as well. All right, that's a pretty broad overview of the ecological principles.